I'm Daniel Williams, 52, and after 30 years of military service protecting this country, I thought my biggest battles were behind me. Last Tuesday, my 25-year-old boss called me into her office and told me I was being restructured out because my energy doesn't match the company culture. What she didn't know was that I had already discovered the age discrimination lawsuit that was about to destroy her career, along with the federal investigation I'd quietly triggered that would expose their illegal hiring practices. She thought she was firing a tired old veteran, but she had just declared war on someone who spent 3 decades learning how to fight and win. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Like this, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age, let me take you back to where this all started. My military service record sits in my home office. 30 years of exemplary service, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and leadership positions that prepared me for battles I never saw coming. I enlisted at 18, straight out of high school in small-town Nebraska, and spent the next 3 decades serving in places most people can't pronounce. The Army taught me discipline, strategic thinking, and how to lead men and women. Under impossible circumstances, I commanded logistics operations in Iraq, managed supply chains in Afghanistan, and trained recruits who became leaders themselves. By the time I retired as a master sergeant, I had overseen budgets exceeding $50 million and coordinated operations across multiple continents. But transitioning to civilian life, that was harder than any deployment I'd faced. The first shock was the interview process. Corporate recruiters would light up when they saw my resume until they met me in person. Suddenly, my experience managing complex military operations became not quite the right fit for our dynamic environment. My proven leadership of diverse teams under pressure was translated as potentially too rigid for our collaborative culture. The technology gap felt insurmountable at first. While I'd been coordinating military communications and logistics systems, the corporate world had moved to cloud-based everything, instant messaging, and social media marketing. I spent months teaching myself Excel, PowerPoint, and project management, software that kids half my age seemed to understand intuitively. What frustrated me most was the assumption that military experience meant I couldn't adapt or think creatively. In the Army, we called it improvise, adapt, overcome, but somehow civilian employers translated my background as inflexible and set in old ways. They wanted my organizational skills and leadership experience, but not the person who came with them. The corporate world operates on different principles than the military. In the Army, respect is earned through competence and character, regardless of age. You listen to the sergeant with 20 years of experience because he's kept people alive and missions successful. But in corporate America, I quickly learned that a 25-year-old MBA with no real-world experience could outrank a decorated veteran simply because they spoke the language of disruption and innovation. I watched younger colleagues get promoted over more experienced workers, not because they were more capable, but because they fit the image of what modern business leadership was supposed to look like. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent decades defending the freedoms that allowed these companies to exist, only to discover they had no interest in defending the value of experience and wisdom. The loneliness of corporate life was something I hadn't anticipated. In the military, you're part of something bigger than yourself. Every person has your back, and you have theirs. But corporate America felt like a collection of individuals all competing against each other, where showing vulnerability or asking for help was seen as weakness rather than wisdom. Still, I persevered. I updated my wardrobe, learned the corporate buzzwords, and slowly built a reputation as someone who could deliver results. My military training in strategic planning and crisis management proved invaluable. even if I had to translate it into business terminology. When younger colleagues panicked under pressure, I remained calm, and methodical skills that had kept soldiers alive were now keeping projects on track and under budget. The adjustment took 2 years, but I finally felt like I was finding my place in the civilian world. I had proven that an old soldier could learn new tricks, that experience and wisdom had value even in a youth-obsessed culture. I thought I had overcome the biggest challenge of my post-military life. I had no idea the real battle was just beginning. My job application portfolio from that period tells a story of systematic rejection that I didn't fully understand at the time. Folder after folder of applications, follow-up emails, and polite rejection letters, each one a small cut that eventually revealed a larger wound. We've decided to go with a candidate who better fits our company culture. While your experience is impressive, we're looking for someone with a different energy level. We've chosen to move forward with a candidate who brings a fresh perspective to the role. The language was always coded, always careful, but the message was clear. You're too old. For 8 months, I applied to over 200 positions. My resume was solid. Military leadership experience, proven track record of managing complex operations, security clearance that companies valued, and testimonials from colleagues who respected my work. But somehow, I couldn't get past the interview stage. The worst part was watching younger candidates with half my experience get offers for positions I was overqualified for. I started to question everything about myself. Was I presenting poorly? Was my experience actually irrelevant? Had the world really changed so much that 30 years of leadership and problem-solving meant nothing? Then I met Richard Hoffman at a veterans networking event. He was 62, a former Navy officer who'd been job hunting for over a year. They want our security clearances and our work ethic, he said over coffee, but they don't want us. They want the benefits of our experience packaged in a 28-year-old body. That conversation opened my eyes to what I was really facing. This wasn't about my qualifications or interview skills. It was about age discrimination so pervasive it had become normalized. Richard introduced me to a whole community of older workers who'd been pushed aside, their experience devalued in favor of digital natives and cultural fits. When TechFlow Solutions finally called me back for a second interview, I was so grateful I ignored the red flags. The first interview had been with Tom Martinez, the 55-year-old head of operations, who appreciated my military background and strategic thinking abilities. But the second interview was with Sarah Chen, the 25-year-old vice president, who would be my direct supervisor. Sarah walked into the conference room like she owned the building, which, given her family's investment in the company, she practically did. Stanford MBA, venture capital connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no in any meaningful way. She was brilliant, I'll give her that. But brilliance combined with inexperience and entitlement creates a dangerous cocktail. So, Daniel, she said, not bothering to look up from her phone as she spoke, tell me how you think your ... traditional experience translates to our innovative approach to supply chain optimization. The word traditional hung in the air like smoke. I knew exactly what she meant, but I needed this job. My savings were running low, and my wife, Linda, was starting to worry about our retirement plans, so I swallowed my pride and gave her the answers she wanted to hear about adaptability and learning new systems. That's interesting, she said when I finished. We'll be in touch. I left that interview knowing I probably wouldn't get the job. Sarah had already decided I wasn't the right fit before I walked in the room. But 2 weeks later, Tom Martinez called me personally to offer the position. Later, I learned he'd had to fight for me, arguing that my experience was exactly what their growing company needed. Sarah wasn't enthusiastic, Tom admitted during my first week, but she'll come around when she sees what you can do. I thought he was right. I thought competence and results would speak for themselves. I had no idea I was walking into a war zone where my age and experience would be weapons used against me rather than assets that made the company stronger. The irony is that I was thrilled to get the job. After months of rejection, TechFlow Solutions felt like salvation. I had no way of knowing it would become the battlefield where I'd fight the most important campaign of my life. My first-year performance review documents still sit in my filing cabinet, a testament to what happens when experience meets opportunity. Exceptional performance in all categories. Exceeded targets by 40%. Invaluable team member and natural leader. Those weren't just empty corporate praise words. They represented real results that directly contradicted everything Sarah Chen would later claim about my supposed inadequacies. Within 6 months, I had transformed the logistics operations that had been bleeding money and missing deadlines. My military background in supply chain management translated perfectly to coordinating deliveries across multiple time zones and vendors. Where the previous system relied on constant firefighting and last-minute solutions, I implemented predictable processes and contingency planning that actually prevented problems before they occurred. The Jameson Industries contract was my first major victory. They were a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been frustrated with TechFlow's inconsistent delivery schedules and communication gaps. Previous account managers had treated them like a necessary nuisance rather than a valued client. I approached them the way I'd approached building relationships with local commanders in overseas deployments, with respect, transparency, and reliable follow-through. Finally, someone who understands that this is about more than just moving widgets around. Jim Jameson told me after our 3rd month working together, "You actually listen to what we need instead of just trying to sell us what you have." That relationship-building approach, which Sarah would later dismiss as old-fashioned networking, resulted in Jameson Industries increasing their contract value by 300% and referring to other companies to us. In military terms, I had secured not just one strategic alliance, but opened up an entire theater of operations. The Morrison Group contract followed a similar pattern. They had been considering ending their relationship with TechFlow due to communication breakdowns and missed deadlines. Instead of making excuses or shifting blame tactics I'd seen too often in corporate environments, I took personal responsibility for the problems and presented a detailed recovery plan. "This is what accountability looks like," Morrison's CEO told Tom Martinez during a client dinner. "Your guy Daniel doesn't just solve problems, he makes sure they don't happen again." By the end of my first year, I had increased revenue by 45% and improved client retention rates from 60% to 89%. The senior leadership team publicly recognized my contributions during the annual company meeting, and several department heads approached me about collaboration opportunities. Tom Martinez made it clear that my experience was exactly what the company needed. "You bring something we've been missing," he said during my performance review. "The younger staff are brilliant with innovation and technology, but you understand how to build sustainable systems and lasting relationships. That's wisdom you can't learn from a textbook." Even some of the younger employees began seeking my advice on client management and project planning. Maria Rodriguez, a talented analyst in her late 20s, became my unofficial protege. "You don't just tell us what to do," she said. "You explain why it works and how to think through similar problems in the future." But every success I achieved seemed to increase Sarah's hostility rather than earn her respect. Where Tom saw valuable experience, Sarah saw a threat to her vision of a dynamic, youth-driven culture. My proven ability to solve problems and build relationships was reframed as resistance to innovative approaches and disruptive thinking. During team meetings, Sarah would introduce new initiatives with comments like, "I know some people prefer the old ways of doing things, but we need to embrace change." Her eyes would always find me when she said "some people," making it clear who she considered the obstacle to progress. The more successful I became, the more isolated Sarah tried to make me. Success, I was learning, could be just as dangerous as failure when you're working for someone who sees your competence as a personal attack on their authority. I should have recognized the warning signs, but I was too focused on doing good work and proving my value. In the military, excellence is rewarded and respected. I hadn't yet learned that in some corporate environments, excellence from the wrong demographic can be seen as insubordination. The internal company emails I later obtained through discovery tell a story that I was living but didn't fully understand at the time. Sarah's messages to her inner circle of young managers painted a clear picture of her strategy to marginalize older employees under the guise of modernization and cultural evolution. We need to transition away from legacy thinking patterns, she wrote to her lieutenant, Jake Morrison, a 26-year-old MBA who'd been promoted to senior analyst after 8 months with the company. Some of our older team members are anchored to outdated methodologies that limit our growth potential. The technology became Sarah's primary weapon in this generational warfare. Every few months, she would announce the adoption of some new or communication system, always with the implicit message that younger employees would naturally excel while older workers would struggle to adapt. When she introduced Slack as our primary communication tool, replacing the email system that had worked perfectly well, she made a point of saying, "I know this might be challenging for some of our more traditional team members, but we need to meet our clients where they are in the digital landscape." I learned Slack in 2 days, the same way I'd learned military communication systems throughout my career. Adaptability was a core military skill, not a generational trait. But Sarah's narrative required me to be a struggling dinosaur, so my quick adoption of new tools was either ignored or dismissed as an exception that proved the rule. The real conflict came during our quarterly strategy sessions. Sarah favored flashy presentations with lots of buzzwords about disrupting traditional paradigms and leveraging synergistic solutions. My approach focused on concrete metrics, risk assessment, and sustainable growth strategies, the same methodical planning that had served me well in military operations. "Daniel, I appreciate your ... thorough ... approach," Sarah would say during meetings, her tone suggesting that thoroughness was somehow a character flaw. "But we need to be more agile and responsive to market dynamics. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks instead of over-planning every detail." The irony was that my over-planning had consistently delivered better results than her agile approach. My projects came in on time and under budget, while several of her innovative initiatives had failed spectacularly. But failure, apparently, was less important than being seen as innovative and forward-thinking. Sarah began building her alliance of younger managers systematically. Jake Morrison, Lisa Park, and David Chen, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname, formed her inner circle, all under 30, all eager to advance their careers by aligning with the VP who controlled promotions and project assignments during a team-building event that I now realize was actually a strategic planning session for my eventual removal. Sarah made her philosophy clear. The most successful companies are led by people who understand digital native thinking, she announced to the group. We can't let institutional knowledge become institutional inertia. The message was unmistakable. Institutional knowledge was a liability, not an asset. Experience was inertia, not wisdom. And people like me were obstacles to progress, rather than foundations for sustainable growth. My first direct confrontation with Sarah came during a client presentation to Hartwell Industries. I had prepared a comprehensive analysis of their supply chain challenges, including risk mitigation strategies and cost-benefit projections. Sarah wanted to present what she called a dynamic solution framework that was heavy on buzzwords, but light on specifics. We need to show them we're not stuck in old school thinking, she said during our prep meeting. Your approach is very ... comprehensive, but it doesn't demonstrate the innovative mindset they're looking for. With respect, Sarah, I replied. Hartwell's CEO specifically asked for detailed risk analysis and implementation timelines. They're not looking for innovation theater. They're looking for results. The room went silent. I had challenged her judgment directly in front of her young allies. The look she gave me was pure calculation. She was deciding whether to crush me immediately or wait for a better opportunity. I think we need to trust our leadership's vision, Jake Morrison interjected, earning an approving nod from Sarah. Daniel's experience is valuable, but we need to balance that with fresh perspectives. We went with Sarah's approach. Hartwell Industries chose our competitor, citing concerns about our lack of detailed planning and risk assessment. But somehow, this failure was positioned as a learning experience rather than a vindication of my original strategy. I realized that I wasn't just working for someone younger than me. I was working for someone who saw my competence as a personal threat to her authority and my experience as evidence of obsolescence rather than wisdom. The generational divide wasn't just about age, it was about power, respect, and the fundamental question of what kind of experience had value in the modern workplace. The war had been declared, even if I was the only one who didn't know we were fighting yet. The HR database records I eventually accessed revealed a pattern so clear and systematic that it couldn't be attributed to coincidence or market forces. What I had initially thought was personal conflict with Sarah was actually part of a broader strategy to restructure the company's workforce demographic. It started with casual conversations in the break room. Robert Chen, a 58-year-old financial analyst with 15 years at the company, mentioned that he was being encouraged to consider early retirement. They're offering a package, he said, stirring his coffee slowly. Sarah thinks my position could be optimized with someone who has more experience with fintech platforms. Robert had been managing the company's financial modeling and risk assessment for over a decade. His departure would save the company about $40,000 annually if they replaced him with a recent graduate. But it would also eliminate institutional knowledge that couldn't be replicated by someone fresh out of business school. Then I noticed Margaret Sullivan's situation. Margaret was 53, a client relations manager who had built relationships with some of our most valuable long-term contracts. She'd been with TechFlow for 12 years, but suddenly her client management style was being described as not aligned with our evolving customer engagement strategies. They want me to start using some new CRM system that tracks every interaction and generates automated follow-up sequences. Margaret told me during lunch, I've been managing relationships based on understanding what each client actually needs, but apparently that's not scalable enough. Margaret's approach had resulted in a 94% client retention rate in her portfolio, significantly higher than the company average, but her methods were being criticized as relationship dependent rather than system dependent, as if building trust and understanding was somehow a business weakness. The pattern became undeniable when I connected with other veterans through our monthly networking group. James Patterson, a former Marine who'd been working in project management for 8 years, had just been laid off from his position at a consulting firm. Budget cuts, they told him, even though the company had just hired 3 recent graduates for positions that paid less but required significantly more training and supervision. They're calling it right-sizing and optimizing human capital, James said during our coffee meeting. But look around. Every person they're cutting is over 45. Every person they're hiring is under 30. That's not budget optimization. That's age discrimination with better marketing. I started paying closer attention to TechFlow's hiring patterns. In the past 18 months, 17 new employees had been hired. 16 of them were under 32 years old. The one exception was a 28-year-old who had been promoted internally. Meanwhile, 6 employees over 45 had been transitioned out through restructuring, early retirement packages, or performance improvement plans that seemed designed to encourage resignation rather than actual improvement. The mathematics were stark, but the methodology was sophisticated. No one was being fired explicitly because of their age. Instead, older employees were being systematically devalued through changing job requirements, new technological demands, cultural misalignment, and performance standards that seemed to shift whenever someone over 45 started meeting them. I began documenting everything with the methodical approach that had served me well in military intelligence gathering: hiring dates, termination reasons, replacement timelines, and salary comparisons. I tracked which managers were making these decisions and looked for patterns in their justifications. Sarah Chen's department showed the most dramatic demographic shift. When she'd been promoted to VP 18 months ago, her department had been 40% employees over 40. Now it was 12% over 40. With most of the change attributed to cultural alignment initiatives and workforce modernization. The veteran community proved invaluable for understanding the broader scope of the problem. At our monthly meeting, I met 7 other former military personnel who'd experienced similar situations across different companies. The tactics were remarkably consistent: subtle marginalization, changing job requirements, technology adoption used as a weapon, and cultural fit assessments that seemed designed to favor youth over experience. "They want our security clearances and our work ethic," said Linda Morrison, a former Air Force logistics specialist, "but they don't want to pay for our experience or respect our contributions. They'd rather hire 3 inexperienced people for what they're paying one of us, even if those 3 people produce half the results." That's when I realized this wasn't just about my job or even TechFlow solutions. This was about a systematic devaluation of experience and institutional knowledge in favor of a business model that prioritized short-term cost savings over long-term competence and stability. I had spent 30 years defending American values and freedoms, only to discover that American businesses were systematically discriminating against the very people who had served their country. The irony was bitter, but it also clarified my mission. This wasn't just about my career anymore. It was about fighting a form of discrimination that was affecting thousands of veterans and older workers across the country. My military training had taught me that you don't win wars by fighting individual battles. You win by understanding the enemy's strategy, gathering intelligence, and developing a comprehensive campaign that addresses the root causes rather than just the symptoms. Sarah Chen thought she was managing me out of her department. She had no idea she was about to become the face of a federal case that would expose systematic age discrimination and veteran rights violations across an entire industry. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. It was time to begin the real operation. My digital evidence files grew systematically over the next 3 months, each document and recording carefully catalogued with the precision I'd learned from handling classified military intelligence. In the Army, sloppy documentation could get people killed. In civilian employment law, sloppy documentation could get your case dismissed. The recording equipment was surprisingly easy to obtain. A small digital recorder that looked like a pen, a smartphone app that could capture audio during meetings, and a friend in IT security who understood exactly what I was trying to accomplish. Tom Brennan was a fellow veteran who worked for a cybersecurity firm and had seen enough corporate discrimination cases to know how to gather evidence legally and effectively. "Document everything," Tom advised during one of our Saturday morning coffee meetings. "Dates, times, witnesses, exact quotes. Corporate lawyers are very good at creating plausible alternative explanations for individual incidents, but they can't explain away a systematic pattern of discriminatory behavior." My first major breakthrough came during a departmental meeting. where Sarah was explaining the new performance optimization standards she was implementing. The language was carefully neutral, but the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. We're implementing metrics that prioritize adaptability, innovation mindset, and cultural alignment, she announced to the assembled team. These factors will be weighted equally with traditional performance indicators in our quarterly reviews. I raised my hand. Could you clarify what specific behaviors demonstrate innovation mindset? I want to make sure I understand the expectations. Sarah's smile was perfectly professional and completely predatory. Well, Daniel, it's really about embracing change rather than defaulting to established methodologies. Some team members naturally demonstrate flexibility in their approach to problem solving, while others tend to rely on more traditional ... frameworks. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable, while creating a subjective standard that could be applied discriminatory. Innovation, mindset, cultural alignment, and adaptability were all qualities that could be attributed to anyone based on age, bias rather than actual performance or capability. The recording captured not just her words, but the tone and context. That made the discriminatory intent clear. When played back, you could hear the emphasis she placed on traditional, and the slight pause that made it clear she was talking about age-related characteristics rather than job performance. My collaboration with IT security friend Tom proved invaluable when I needed to document the systematic nature of the discrimination. He helped me understand how to access publicly available information about company hiring patterns, salary databases, and demographic trends without violating any privacy laws or employment agreements. Look at the metadata on email communications, Tom suggested. Response times, communication patterns, meeting invitations, all of that creates a digital footprint that can demonstrate differential treatment based on protected characteristics. The patterns were stark when analyzed systematically. Sarah responded to emails from employees under 35 within an average of 4.2 hours. Emails from employees over 45 averaged 18.7 hours for responses. Meeting invitations showed similar patterns. Younger employees were included in strategic planning sessions and informal discussions at much higher rates than older employees with equivalent or superior job responsibilities. I spent evenings and weekends researching federal employment law, particularly the Age Discrimination in Employment Act and veteran protection statutes. The legal framework was clear. Employers couldn't make employment decisions based on age or veteran status, but proving discriminatory intent required demonstrating patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. My legal research led me to contact Jennifer Walsh, an employment attorney who specialized in age discrimination and veteran rights cases. Our initial consultation was eye-opening. What you're describing fits a classic pattern, Jennifer explained during our meeting. Modern age discrimination rarely involves someone saying you're too old. Instead, it's done through subjective performance standards, cultural fit assessments, and technology requirements that disproportionately impact older workers. Jennifer helped me understand the documentation standards required for a federal complaint. Every incident needed corroborating evidence, emails, witness statements, performance reviews, and demographic data that demonstrated systematic rather than individual bias. The Employment Opportunity Commission complaint required comprehensive documentation of not just individual incidents, but company-wide patterns that suggested systematic discrimination. Jennifer helped me organize my evidence into categories: direct evidence of discriminatory statements, comparative evidence showing differential treatment, and statistical evidence demonstrating company-wide patterns. The strongest cases combine all three types of evidence, Jennifer explained. Individual incidents can be explained away as personality conflicts or performance issues, but systematic patterns affecting multiple protected class members create a compelling case for institutional discrimination. Preparing the federal complaint took 6 weeks of careful documentation and legal review. Every statement had to be factually accurate and legally significant. Every piece of evidence had to be properly obtained and authentic. The complaint itself was 23 pages of detailed allegations, supported by over 40 exhibits. But the EEOC complaint was just the beginning. Jennifer also helped me file a complaint with the Department of Labor's Veterans Employment and Training Service, which had additional authority to investigate veteran-specific employment discrimination. The combination of age discrimination and veteran status created multiple federal jurisdictions and enforcement mechanisms. Companies can sometimes navigate around EEOC investigations, Jennifer told me. But when you add Department of Labor, veteran protections, and potential media attention, it becomes much more difficult for them to dismiss the situation quietly. I also reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in employment discrimination stories. The veteran angle, combined with systematic age discrimination, created exactly the kind of story that could generate public pressure beyond just the legal process. By the time I finished building my case, I had created a comprehensive multi-front campaign that would attack the problem through federal agencies, legal channels, media pressure, and public awareness. Sarah Chen thought she was managing out one problematic older employee. She had no idea she was about to become the center of a federal investigation that would expose systematic discrimination affecting thousands of veterans and older workers. The intelligence was gathered. The battle plan was complete. Now it was time to execute the operation. The federal complaint filing was like launching a coordinated military operation. Multiple moving parts that had to be timed precisely to achieve maximum impact. My EEOC complaint was submitted on a Tuesday morning, followed by the Department of Labor veteran discrimination complaint that afternoon, an initial contact with investigative journalists by Thursday. The EEOC complaint detailed systematic age discrimination affecting not just me, but the broader pattern of older worker displacement at TechFlow Solutions. 23 pages of carefully documented evidence, including the demographic analysis showing that 87% of recent terminations involved employees over 45, while 94% of new hires were under 32. The respondent company has engaged in a systematic pattern of age discrimination, the complaint stated, utilizing subjective performance standards, cultural alignment assessments, and technology adaptation requirements that disproportionately impact older workers, particularly military veterans who have served their country with distinction. The Department of Labor complaint focused specifically on veteran employment rights, citing the federal protections designed to prevent exactly the kind of discrimination I had experienced. The respondent has violated veteran employment protection statutes by creating hostile work environment conditions and implementing discriminatory employment practices that specifically target former military personnel. Jennifer Walsh had prepared me for the investigation process, but she also emphasized the importance of building public pressure alongside the legal proceedings. Federal agencies are understaffed and overworked, she explained. Cases that generate media attention and public interest tend to receive more thorough investigation and faster resolution. My first call was to Michael Rodriguez, AN investigative reporter with the National Veterans Journal, who had written extensively about corporate discrimination against former military personnel. His response was immediate and enthusiastic. This fits perfectly with a broader story I've been researching, Michael told me during our phone conversation. I've been tracking similar patterns at technology companies across the country. Would you be willing to go on record with specific examples and documentation? The second media contact was Sarah Martinez at the Washington Business Tribune, who specialized in employment law and corporate accountability stories. Her interest focused on the systematic nature of the discrimination and its potential impact on an entire industry. "What you're describing isn't just one company's bad behavior," Sarah explained. "This could be evidence of industry-wide practices that are violating federal law while disguising discrimination as business modernization." Building relationships with employment attorneys across the country revealed that my situation was part of a much larger problem. Jennifer connected me with colleagues in California, Texas, and New York, who were handling similar cases involving systematic age discrimination in technology and consulting firms. "We're seeing this pattern everywhere," explained David Chen, an employment attorney in Silicon Valley. "Companies are using culture fit and innovation mindset as code words for age discrimination. The challenge is building cases strong enough to demonstrate the systematic nature of the bias." My networking with other veterans produced a crucial development. 3 other former military personnel who had experienced similar discrimination at companies in our metropolitan area were willing to join a coordinated legal response. James Patterson, the former Marine I'd met earlier, had documentation from his consulting firm Termination that showed remarkably similar patterns to what I'd experienced at TechFlow. "They used almost identical language," James said, comparing his Termination documentation to mine. "Cultural alignment, innovation, mindset, digital native thinking. It's like they're all reading from the same playbook for getting rid of older workers without explicitly saying it's about age." The coordination with other complainants strengthened our individual cases while building toward a potential class action lawsuit. Jennifer explained that multiple complaints against different companies in the same industry could demonstrate that this wasn't just individual corporate bad behavior, but a systematic industry practice. My strategic positioning had created multiple pressure points that would be difficult for TechFlow to address simultaneously. The EEOC investigation required them to respond to federal inquiries and provide documentation about their hiring and termination practices. The Department of Labor investigation brought additional federal scrutiny with potential financial penalties. The media attention threatened their public reputation and client relationships. But the most important element was timing. I had filed these complaints while still employed, which meant TechFlow couldn't dismiss me as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Any retaliation against me for filing federal complaints would create additional federal violations that would strengthen rather than weaken my case. Sarah Chen had no idea that while she was planning my termination, I was building a comprehensive case that would expose not just her individual bias, but systematic discrimination that could result in federal investigations, financial penalties, and public accountability for the entire company. The pieces were in place. Multiple federal agencies were beginning investigations. Journalists were preparing stories. Other victims were coordinating their responses. Employment attorneys were building toward broader legal action. I was still reporting to work every day, still delivering excellent results, still being professional and courteous to Sarah and her allies. But underneath the surface of normal corporate routine, a federal investigation was gathering momentum that would ultimately expose systematic discrimination affecting thousands of veterans and older workers. Sarah thought she was controlling the timeline and the process. She had no idea that I had already shifted the battlefield to federal agencies and public accountability measures where her youth, connections, and corporate position provided no protection against evidence-based legal proceedings. The setup was complete. Now I just had to wait for her to make the move that would activate everything I had put in place. The restructuring memo that eventually became evidence in our federal case was Sarah's masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, a document that laid out her plan to eliminate older workers while maintaining plausible deniability about discriminatory intent. I obtained it later through the discovery process, but at the time, I could only observe the effects of her strategy unfolding. Sarah's promotion to department head came through in March, with Tom Martinez being moved to a senior advisory role that everyone understood meant being pushed aside to make room for fresh leadership. The announcement email was a perfect example of corporate euphemism. We're excited to leverage Sarah's innovative vision and dynamic leadership style to optimize our departmental capabilities for the evolving marketplace. Translation: they were replacing a 55-year-old experienced manager with a 25-year-old who looked the part of modern business leadership, regardless of actual competence or track record. Sarah's first department meeting as the official head was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to establish her authority while signaling major changes ahead. She walked in wearing a sharp black suit that probably cost more than most employees made in a month, carrying a tablet instead of papers, and projecting the kind of confident energy that corporate boards associate with innovation and progress. "I want to talk about transformation," she began, making eye contact with each of the younger employees, while carefully avoiding looking at me or the other employees over 40. "We're not just managing a department, we're building the future of supply chain optimization in the digital economy." The PowerPoint presentation that followed was heavy on buzzwords and light on specifics. Human capital optimization, workforce agility enhancement, cultural alignment initiatives, performance framework modernization. Each phrase was designed to sound progressive and necessary while providing cover for decisions that would disproportionately impact older workers. "Some of our current approaches," Sarah continued, clicking to a slide titled Legacy Methodology Challenges, "reflect outdated paradigms that limit our growth potential. We need team members who can adapt quickly to changing market dynamics and embrace disruptive thinking." The slide included a chart showing traditional versus innovative approaches that was clearly designed to characterize experience-based discipline as obsolete while portraying untested new methods as inherently superior. Thorough planning became analysis paralysis. Relationship building was dependency on personal networks. Risk assessment was resistance to bold initiatives. I took careful notes, knowing that this presentation would eventually become evidence of systematic bias disguised as business strategy. Every phrase Sarah used was carefully chosen to provide legal cover while communicating her real intention to eliminate employees she considered too old for her vision of a modern workplace. The restructuring plan she unveiled was ingenious in its subtlety. Instead of announcing layoffs or terminations, she introduced a performance enhancement initiative that would evaluate all employees based on adaptability metrics, innovation indicators, and cultural alignment assessments. "Everyone will have the opportunity to demonstrate their value within our evolving framework," Sarah announced, her smile perfectly professional and completely predatory. "Those who embrace change and show growth mindset characteristics will find tremendous opportunities for advancement." The evaluation criteria were masterfully subjective. Innovation mindset could mean anything from suggesting new software to agreeing with Sarah's opinions. Cultural alignment was entirely based on her personal assessment of whether someone fit her vision of what the department should look like. Adaptability meant accepting whatever changes she wanted to implement, without questioning their effectiveness or necessity. Jake Morrison, her loyal lieutenant, was promoted to Senior Strategic Analyst, a newly created position that put him in charge of implementing the new evaluation system. Lisa Park became Cultural Alignment Coordinator, responsible for assessing team members' fit with the new departmental vision. David Chen was named Innovation Metrics Specialist, tasked with developing measurement tools for the subjective performance standards. The three of them, all under 30, all completely loyal to Sarah, all eager to advance their careers. By identifying older employees as obstacles to progress, would be evaluating the performance and future of workers with decades more experience and consistently superior results. During the individual meetings that followed, Sarah made her expectations clear to each of us separately. When my turn came, she was all professional courtesy and thinly veiled threats. "Daniel, I want to be transparent with you about our direction," she said, leaning back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed she held all the power. "The metrics we're implementing will require significant adaptation from some of our more traditional team members." She paused to let that sink in before continuing. "I'm not questioning your experience or past contributions, but we need to ensure that everyone on the team can meet the performance standards that our evolving business model requires." The message was unmistakable. Adapt to her vision of what the workplace should look like, or be identified as a performance problem that needed to be eliminated. My age, my experience, and my military background were all being reframed as liabilities rather than assets. "I appreciate your direct communication," I replied, maintaining the calm tone that had served me well in military briefings with hostile commanders. "Could you provide specific examples of the adaptation you're looking for? I want to make sure I understand exactly what success looks like under the new framework." Sarah's smile became sharper. "That's exactly the kind of structured thinking that we need to move beyond, Daniel. Success in our new framework isn't about following specific examples. It's about demonstrating spontaneous innovation and intuitive cultural alignment. In other words, success would be whatever she decided it was, based on criteria that could change whenever someone started meeting them. It was a rigged game designed to produce predetermined outcomes while maintaining the appearance of objective evaluation. But Sarah had made a crucial mistake. By outlining her plan so clearly and using language that was obviously coded age discrimination, she had provided me with exactly the kind of evidence that federal investigators look for in systematic bias cases. She thought she was explaining the rules of a game she controlled. She had no idea she was providing testimony that would be used against her in federal proceedings that were already underway. The power play was complete, but the real power had already shifted to federal agencies and legal processes that she couldn't control or manipulate. Sarah Chen had just declared war on someone who had been preparing for this battle for months, and who had weapons she didn't even know existed. The meeting recording that would become the centerpiece of my federal case began with Sarah's assistant calling me at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. "Sarah would like to see you in conference room B at 5 o'clock, Jessica said, her voice carefully neutral in the way that administrative assistants learn when they're delivering bad news they can't acknowledge. I had been expecting this call for weeks. The digital recorder was already in my shirt pocket, activated with a quick double tap that I'd practiced until it became automatic. After 30 years of military operations, I understood the importance of being prepared for critical moments when everything you've worked for can be decided in a few minutes. Conference Room B was Sarah's preferred location for difficult conversations, smaller than the main conference room, with windows that looked out on the parking lot instead of the city skyline. It was designed to feel cramped and uncomfortable, a psychological tactic to make people want to get out quickly rather than ask difficult questions or challenge decisions. Sarah was already seated when I arrived, flanked by Jake, Morrison, and someone I didn't recognize, a woman in her 30s wearing a conservative business suit and carrying a legal pad. The stranger introduced herself as Rebecca Walsh from Human Resources, though I'd never seen her before despite working at TechFlow for over a year. "Thank you for coming, Daniel," Sarah began, her tone professionally pleasant in the way that people use when they're about to destroy your life but want to maintain plausible deniability about their motives. "We need to discuss some changes in your role and responsibilities." The recording captured not just her words, but the tone that made it clear. This wasn't a discussion about role changes. It was a termination meeting. disguised as a performance conversation. Every word was carefully chosen to provide legal cover while communicating the predetermined outcome. As you know, we've been implementing our new performance framework and evaluating how different team members align with our evolving departmental needs, Sarah continued, consulting notes that had obviously been prepared in advance. After careful consideration, we've determined that your current position is no longer aligned with our strategic direction. I maintained the calm expression that had served me well in military briefings where superior officers were making decisions based on politics rather than competence. Could you be more specific about what aspects of my performance don't align with departmental needs? My recent client retention and revenue numbers have exceeded targets by significant margins. Rebecca Walsh from HR jumped in with obviously rehearsed language. This isn't about individual performance metrics, Daniel. It's about overall fit with the company culture and our evolving business model. We're restructuring to optimize human capital allocation across different strategic priorities. The corporate euphemisms were flying thick and fast, but Sarah couldn't resist making her real feelings clear. The reality is that your energy doesn't match our company culture, Daniel. We need team members who can adapt quickly to our dynamic environment and embrace innovation without defaulting to traditional methodologies. There it was, the exact language that would become evidence of age discrimination in federal court. Energy and traditional methodologies were classic code words for age bias, and Sarah had delivered them directly into my recording device while being witnessed by an HR representative. I'm curious about the specific energy and methodology concerns, I replied, maintaining my calm tone while ensuring that the recording captured both the discriminatory language and my professional response. Could you provide examples of situations where my approach was problematic? Jake Morrison leaned forward with the eager expression of someone who thought he was delivering a crushing blow. It's not about specific incidents, Daniel. It's about your overall mindset and approach. You tend to overanalyze situations instead of being agile and responsive to changing conditions. Overanalyze was another beauty. Military strategic planning and risk assessment were being characterized as personality flaws rather than valuable skills that had consistently delivered superior results. Sarah regained control of the conversation with the confident smile of someone who believed she was closing a successful operation. We're offering you a generous severance package that includes 6 months' salary and extended health benefits. We think this transition will be beneficial for everyone involved. The severance offer was actually evidence of the company's awareness that they were on legally questionable ground. Generous packages are often used to encourage departing employees to sign non-disclosure agreements rather than pursue legal action. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I'd like to understand the specific performance issues that led to this decision. My documentation shows consistently exceeding targets and receiving positive client feedback. Are there particular incidents or metrics that suggest I'm not meeting expectations? Rebecca Walsh's discomfort was becoming obvious. As an HR professional, she understood that they were creating potential legal liability with every subjective criticism that couldn't be supported by objective performance data. This really isn't about performance issues in the traditional sense, she said, inadvertently admitting that the termination wasn't based on legitimate business reasons. It's about strategic alignment and cultural fit in our evolving organizational structure. Sarah's impatience with the careful HR language was becoming apparent. Daniel, I'm going to be direct with you. The business world is changing rapidly, and we need people who can change with it. Your approach works well in more established environments, but it doesn't fit with where we're headed as a company. Established environments, another perfect piece of evidence that this was about age bias rather than performance. Sarah was essentially saying that my experience and proven methods were liabilities rather than assets. The meeting continued for another 15 minutes, with HR trying to get me to sign severance paperwork, while Sarah made increasingly obvious statements about wanting younger, more dynamic employees. Every comment was captured clearly on the recording, creating a comprehensive record of discriminatory intent that would be difficult for any corporate lawyer to explain away. When I finally left conference room B, I had in my possession the exact evidence that federal investigators look for in age discrimination cases: clear statements tying employment decisions to age-related characteristics, witnesses to discriminatory language, and documentation of the company's attempt to use financial incentives to prevent legal action. Sarah thought she had successfully eliminated a problematic older employee. She had no idea she had just provided the final piece of evidence needed to prove systematic age discrimination in federal court. The termination meeting she had planned as my ending was actually the beginning of her legal nightmare. The recording device in my pocket contained not just my termination, but the confession that would bring down her entire discriminatory system, the severance package that arrived via FedEx. The next morning was a masterpiece of corporate panic disguised as generosity. 8 months' salary instead of the 6 months mentioned in the meeting, extended health benefits for a full year, and a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive it would have prevented me from discussing not just my termination, but virtually any aspect of my employment experience. The legal document was clearly drafted in haste by attorneys who understood they were dealing with potential federal liability. Standard severance packages don't typically include clauses preventing employees from discussing employment experiences with media representatives, government agencies, or legal professionals. That kind of language appears when companies know they've violated federal law and are desperate to prevent public exposure. Jennifer Walsh reviewed the package during our emergency meeting that afternoon, her expression growing more satisfied with each page she read. "This is essentially a confession," she explained. "Companies don't offer packages this generous or demand this level of secrecy unless they know they've created significant legal liability." The financial terms were actually impressive, more money than I would have made during the same period if I'd remained employed, plus benefits that would cover my family's healthcare needs during the legal process. But accepting it would have meant abandoning not just my case, but the broader fight against systematic age discrimination that was affecting thousands of veterans and older workers. "They're betting that the financial pressure will make you prioritize short-term security over long-term justice," Jennifer continued. "It's a rational calculation from their perspective, paying you to disappear costs much less than defending a federal discrimination case that could result in company-wide policy changes and damages for an entire class of affected workers." My refusal to sign came in the form of a carefully worded letter that Jennifer helped me draft. After careful consideration, I must respectfully decline the proposed severance agreement. The terms requested would prevent me from exercising my constitutional rights to report violations of federal employment law and seek appropriate legal remedies for discriminatory treatment. The letter also mentioned my ongoing cooperation with federal investigations, which served notice that this situation had already moved beyond a simple employment dispute into the realm of government enforcement actions. The response from Tech legal department was swift and panicked. Rebecca Walsh called me directly within hours of receiving my letter, her professional composure replaced by barely controlled desperation. "Daniel, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about the severance terms," she said. "We're certainly not trying to prevent you from exercising any legal rights. Perhaps we could discuss modifications to the agreement that would address your concerns." The fact that she was calling personally rather than communicating through attorneys was evidence of how seriously they were taking the situation. HR directors don't usually make direct calls to terminated employees unless there's significant legal exposure involved. "I appreciate your call, Rebecca," I replied, "but I'm comfortable with my decision. I believe the best resolution for everyone involved is for the company to address the systematic issues that led to this situation rather than trying to prevent discussion of those issues." When she hung up, I knew that TechFlow's leadership was beginning to understand the scope of the problem they faced. This wasn't just about one terminated employee seeking financial compensation. It was about federal investigations that could expose company-wide discrimination practices and result in government-mandated policy changes. The EEOC investigator called me that same evening to discuss the termination meeting recording. Agent Maria Santos had 20 years of experience with employment discrimination cases, and her reaction to the audio file was immediately positive. "This is exactly the kind of direct evidence we look for in age discrimination cases," she explained. "The language about energy and traditional methodologies creates a clear pattern of bias, especially when combined with the demographic data showing systematic targeting of older workers." Agent Santos also confirmed that TechFlow would be required to respond to the federal investigation within 30 days, including providing documentation about their hiring and termination practices over the previous 3 years. The company's attempts to resolve my individual case wouldn't affect the broader investigation into systematic discrimination. The Department of Labor Veteran Employment Specialist Thomas Rodriguez was equally encouraging about the strength of the evidence we'd gathered. "Veteran employment protection laws have some of the strongest enforcement mechanisms in federal employment law," he explained. "Companies that discriminate against veterans face not just financial penalties, but potential loss of federal contracts and public accountability measures." By the end of the week, it was clear that TechFlow's leadership had seriously underestimated the situation they were facing. What they'd planned as a simple termination of a problematic older employee had become a multi-agency federal investigation with potential criminal liability for systematic civil rights violations. Sarah Chun's attempt to quietly eliminate me from her department had instead triggered the exact kind of federal scrutiny that could destroy her career and expose systematic discrimination affecting an entire industry. The generous severance package that was supposed to make the problem disappear had instead become evidence of the company's consciousness of guilt. I had refused their money and their silence. Now the real battle could begin, with federal agencies, employment attorneys, and investigative journalists all working to expose the truth about systematic age discrimination in corporate America. The immediate aftermath of my termination had revealed that TechFlow Solutions was much more vulnerable than they realized, and that my case was much stronger than they had anticipated. Sarah thought she had won by getting rid of me. She was about to learn that my departure was actually the beginning of her downfall. The federal investigation notice that arrived at TechFlow Solutions was like a precision-guided missile hitting a target that thought it was safely hidden. The official EEOC letterhead, government seal, and formal legal language transformed my individual complaint into a federal case that would require corporate executives to answer to the United States government. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has initiated a formal investigation into allegations of systematic age discrimination and retaliation, the notice began. TechFlow Solutions, Inc. is hereby required to provide comprehensive documentation regarding hiring, promotion, termination, and compensation practices for all employees aged 40 and older during the period from January 2020 through present. Agent Maria Santos had explained the investigation process during our meeting the previous week, but seeing it in action was remarkably satisfying. Companies can ignore individual complaints or try to discredit former employees, she had told me, but they can't ignore federal investigators with subpoena power and criminal referral authority. The document request was comprehensive and strategically designed to reveal patterns that individual managers might not even realize they were creating. Demographics of all hiring and firing decisions, performance review comparisons across age groups, promotion rates by age category, compensation analysis, and records of all disciplinary actions, the kind of systematic review that would make discriminatory patterns impossible to hide. But the EEOC investigation was just the beginning. The Department of Labor's Veterans Employment and Training Service had initiated a parallel investigation focusing specifically on veteran employment rights violations. Agent Thomas Rodriguez had 25 years of experience investigating corporate discrimination against former military personnel, and his approach was even more aggressive than the EEOC's. Veteran employment protection isn't just civil rights, law, Rodriguez had explained. It's national security policy. Companies that discriminate against veterans are undermining military recruitment and retention. By sending the message that military service is actually a career liability rather than an asset. The Department of Labor investigation included not just employment practices, but TechFlow's compliance with federal contractor requirements. As a company that had received government contracts worth over $2 million in the previous 3 years, TechFlow was subject to veteran hiring requirements and could face contract cancellation if found in violation of federal employment law. TechFlow's response to the federal investigations was immediate and panicked. Within 48 hours of receiving the notices, the company had hired Morrison, Walsh and Associates, a law firm specializing in employment discrimination defense. The fact that they retained external counsel rather than handling the investigation with internal legal resources was evidence of how seriously they were taking the federal scrutiny. Rebecca Walsh, the HR director who had participated in my termination meeting, was apparently reassigned to special projects, corporate euphemism, for being removed from any role that might require testifying about company employment practices. Jake Morrison, Sarah's loyal lieutenant, was suddenly taking vacation time that stretched into weeks. The company's internal panic became obvious when Tom Martinez, my former manager who had originally hired me, reached out through a mutual contact to request a private conversation. We met at a coffee shop 20 minutes from the TechFlow offices, far enough away to avoid any appearance of corporate coordination. "Daniel, I want you to know that your termination doesn't reflect the values that this company was built on," Tom said, looking genuinely distressed. "I've been with TechFlow for 8 years, and what happened to you isn't consistent with how we've traditionally operated." Tom's willingness to meet with me privately was significant, but his comments were even more important. As a senior manager who had opposed my termination, his testimony could provide crucial corroboration for the systematic discrimination allegations. "I can't discuss the details while the investigation is ongoing," Tom continued, "but I want you to know that there are people inside the company who recognize that serious mistakes were made. If you're contacted by federal investigators, they'll find that not everyone supported the decisions that led to your situation." His comments suggested that Sarah's discriminatory practices had created internal opposition within TechFlow's management team. Companies facing federal investigations often see internal divisions emerge between managers who supported the problematic practices and those who were uncomfortable with them but felt unable to object openly. The media attention began with Michael Rodriguez's article in the National Veterans Journal titled "Corporate Age Discrimination Against Veterans, a Federal Case Study." The piece detailed my situation while connecting it to broader patterns of employment discrimination affecting former military personnel across the technology industry. Daniel Williams served his country for 30 years, earning decorations for valor and leadership, the article began. But when he tried to serve American businesses with the same dedication and competence, he discovered that his military experience was viewed as a liability rather than an asset. The article's impact was immediate and significant. Within days, I received calls from 12 other veterans who had experienced similar discrimination at technology companies. 3 of them had documentation that paralleled my case almost exactly. Young supervisors using coded language about cultural fit and innovation mindset to justify terminating older workers with exemplary performance records. The Washington Business Tribune followed with a broader investigation into age discrimination trends across the technology sector. Sarah Martinez's article, The Gray Ceiling: How Tech Companies Systematically Exclude Experienced Workers, used my case as one example of industry-wide practices that violated federal employment law. The language used by TechFlow Solutions, managers' energy, cultural alignment, traditional methodologies appears consistently across discrimination cases involving older workers in the technology sector. The article noted, federal investigators are examining whether this represents coordinated industry practices or parallel evolution of discriminatory hiring and firing strategies. The combination of federal investigations and media coverage had transformed my individual case into a public examination of systematic age discrimination. Sarah Chen had thought she was quietly eliminating one problematic employee. Instead, she had triggered a federal investigation that would expose discriminatory practices affecting thousands of workers across an entire industry. The investigation was no longer just about my termination. It had become about whether American companies would be allowed to systematically discriminate against the very veterans who had served their country, and whether age bias would be permitted to masquerade as business innovation. The battle lines were drawn, and the federal government was now leading the charge. The internal crisis management plan that emerged during discovery revealed just how unprepared TechFlow Solutions was for federal scrutiny of their employment practices. The document, marked confidential attorney-client privilege, outlined a desperate strategy to minimize legal exposure while attempting to discredit the growing evidence of systematic discrimination. Emergency board meetings had been called. Within 72 hours of receiving the federal investigation notices, CEO Robert Harrison, who had previously maintained a hands-off approach to departmental management, was suddenly deeply involved in reviewing every aspect of the company's hiring and termination practices. The board minutes revealed panic among executives who realized they had allowed discriminatory practices to flourish unchecked. We need to conduct immediate damage assessment across all departments, Harrison had announced during the emergency session. This cannot be limited to one department or one disgruntled employee. We're facing potential federal penalties that could threaten the company's entire future. The legal consultations with Morrison, Walsh and Associates painted a grim picture of TechFlow's exposure. Senior partner Rebecca Morrison had been blunt about the company's vulnerability. The demographic patterns alone create presumptive evidence of systematic discrimination, combined with recorded statements about energy and cultural fit. We're facing potentially catastrophic legal liability. TechFlow's initial strategy focused on attacking my credibility rather than addressing the substantial evidence of discrimination. Internal memos outlined plans to characterize me as a disgruntled employee with performance issues who is seeking financial gain through false allegations. The problem with this approach was that my performance reviews, client feedback, and revenue numbers directly contradicted any claims about work quality or professional competence. Sarah Chen had become the company's primary liability, but she was also the person they were most desperate to protect. As the daughter of a major investor and the architect of the workforce modernization strategy, her termination would essentially admit corporate guilt while potentially triggering insider trading concerns if investors had been misled about the company's legal exposure. The attempts to discredit my military service were particularly desperate and ultimately Internal communications revealed discussions about hiring investigators to examine my military record for any incidents that could be used to question my character or reliability. When they discovered my record was exemplary, they shifted to arguing that military experience was fundamentally incompatible with innovative corporate culture. This strategy backfired spectacularly when veteran advocacy groups learned about TechFlow's approach. The veterans of foreign wars issued a public statement condemning corporate attempts to weaponize military service against veterans seeking equal treatment in civilian employment. The American Legion followed with their own statement supporting federal investigation of systematic discrimination disguised as business modernization. Client concerns began mounting as news of the federal investigations spread through industry networks. Jameson Industries, one of my major accounts, sent a formal letter expressing serious concerns about TechFlow's employment practices and their potential impact on our business relationship. Morrison Group followed with a similar communication, noting that their own corporate policies prohibited working with vendors under federal investigation for civil rights violations. The public relations crisis unfolded exactly as Jennifer Walsh had predicted. TechFlow's attempt to quietly eliminate one problematic employee had become a public examination of corporate discrimination practices. The company's stock price dropped 15% within 2 weeks of the first media coverage, wiping out millions in shareholder value. Social media backlash was swift and devastating. LinkedIn posts about the case generated thousands of comments from older workers sharing their own experiences with age discrimination. Twitter hashtags like #veteran discrimination and #AGEISM in tech began trending, with users sharing stories that paralleled my experience at companies across the country. Sarah's public image destruction was comprehensive and irreversible. Her LinkedIn profile, which had previously showcased her as a rising star in corporate leadership, became flooded with comments questioning her management practices and ethical standards. Speaking engagements were cancelled, networking invitations were withdrawn, and her reputation as an innovative leader was replaced by notoriety as the face of systematic workplace discrimination. The crisis management plan's most revealing element was its acknowledgement that Sarah's practices were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader company strategy. The workforce demographic changes implemented over the past 18 months were consistent with corporate objectives to reduce labor costs and modernize company culture, one internal memo admitted. However, the implementation methods may have created legal vulnerabilities that were not adequately assessed. This admission essentially confirmed that TechFlow's discrimination was systematic and intentional. Even if the legal consequences had not been anticipated, the company had deliberately pursued policies designed to eliminate older workers, but had failed to consider whether those policies violated federal employment law. By the end of the month, TechFlow Solutions was facing a perfect storm of federal investigations, media scrutiny, client concerns, stock price decline, and public relations disaster. The board of directors was demanding answers about how a simple personnel decision had become a company-threatening crisis. Sarah Chen had gone from rising corporate star to liability, so toxic that the company was considering whether her termination might be necessary to preserve shareholder value and client relationships. The irony was perfect. The person who had systematically eliminated older workers based on their supposed incompatibility with modern business was now facing elimination herself due to her incompatibility with legal and ethical business practices. The crisis management plan had become a confession. The damage control efforts had amplified the damage, and the attempts to discredit me had instead discredited the company. Sarah's power play had turned into a complete corporate disaster, with federal agencies circling like sharks who had detected blood in the water. The news article draft that eventually ran on the front page of the Washington Business Tribune was A masterpiece of investigative journalism that connected my individual case to systematic industry-wide discrimination. Sarah Martinez had spent 6 weeks researching not just TechFlow Solutions, but 12 other technology companies with similar patterns of age-based workforce changes. Veterans Betrayed: How Corporate America Turns Military Service into Employment Liability became the headline that transformed a local employment dispute into a national conversation about veteran rights and age discrimination. The article's impact was immediate and devastating for companies that had assumed their discriminatory practices would remain hidden behind corporate euphemisms and legal technicalities. Michael Rodriguez's follow-up piece in the National Veterans Journal provided the human face that made the statistical evidence emotionally compelling. His interview with me, conducted in my home office surrounded by military commendations and family photos, painted a picture that resonated with millions of veterans who had experienced similar treatment. I spent 30 years protecting American freedoms, I told Michael during the recorded interview, only to discover that American businesses felt free to discriminate against the very people who had served their country. The irony isn't just bitter, it's a betrayal of everything we thought we were fighting for. The strategic media interviews I gave were carefully coordinated with Jennifer Walsh to ensure they supported rather than compromised our legal strategy. Each interview focused on the systematic nature of the discrimination rather than personal grievances, and emphasized the broader implications for veteran employment rights and age bias in corporate America. CNN's morning show interview reached 12 million viewers and generated thousands of social media responses from veterans sharing their own experiences. When the anchor asked how I felt about being terminated, my response had been prepared to maximize impact. I didn't serve my country for 30 years to be told at 52 that my energy and experience are liabilities rather than assets. The 60-minute segment, which aired 6 weeks after my termination, included hidden camera footage of employment consultants advising companies on how to eliminate older workers without violating federal law. The techniques they recommended: subjective performance standards, cultural fit assessments, and technology requirements that disproportionately impact older workers, were identical to what I had experienced at TechFlow Solutions. Fumbled public response made the situation exponentially worse. CEO Robert Harrison's first public statement attempted to dismiss the federal investigations as routine regulatory review and characterized my case as an isolated personnel matter involving a disgruntled former employee. This strategy collapsed when reporters obtained the demographic data showing systematic elimination of older workers across multiple departments. The company's second statement, issued after their legal team realized the first had been a disaster, attempted to express commitment to equal opportunity employment while defending Sarah Chen's management decisions as based entirely on performance and business requirements. This statement was immediately contradicted by the recording of my termination meeting, which had been leaked to investigative journalists by sources within the federal investigations. Sarah's personal public relations nightmare began when attempted to have her conduct media interviews defending the company's employment practices. Her first television appearance was a disaster that revealed both her inexperience with media scrutiny and her fundamental inability to defend discriminatory practices without making them sound even worse. "We absolutely do not discriminate based on age," Sarah insisted during a local news interview, her nervousness obvious to anyone watching. "Our employment decisions are based on cultural alignment, innovation mindset, and adaptability to changing business requirements." The interviewer's follow-up question devastated her. "Aren't those exactly the kind of subjective criteria that employment law experts say can be used to disguise age discrimination? And don't they disproportionately impact older workers regardless of their actual performance?" Sarah's response: "Well, Some approaches to business are naturally more compatible with modern workplace dynamics, became a viral social media clip that perfectly illustrated the coded language used to justify age bias. The video was shared over 50,000 times, with comments mocking her attempt to make discrimination sound like business strategy. The social media backlash was swift, comprehensive, and utterly destructive to both Sarah's reputation and tech public image. Hashtag #SarahToonses became a trending hashtag, where users posted examples of discriminatory language disguised as business terminology. Hashtag veteran discrimination generated thousands of stories from former military personnel who had experienced similar treatment at companies across the country. LinkedIn discussions about the case generated engagement levels typically reserved for major industry announcements or economic crises. Senior executives from competing companies began publicly distancing themselves from age-based hiring practices, while veteran advocacy groups organized boycotts of companies with similar demographic patterns in their workforce. The national conversation had shifted from my individual case to systematic examination of whether corporate America was systematically discriminating against the very people who had served their country. Editorial pages across the country picked up the story, with major newspapers calling for federal enforcement action and corporate accountability measures. Fortune magazine's cover story, "The Age Bias Crisis: How Corporate Culture Became Corporate Discrimination," used TechFlow as a case study while examining similar practices at dozens of major corporations. The article's demographic analysis revealed that technology companies had systematically reduced their workforce age across the board, often using the same coded language and subjective performance standards that Sarah had employed. The media spotlight had transformed my termination from a personal setback into a national symbol of veteran employment rights and age discrimination. Sarah Chen had gone from rising corporate star to the public face of systematic workplace bias, while TechFlow Solutions had become synonymous with the kind of discriminatory practices that federal law was designed to prevent. Every interview I gave, every article that was published, and every social media discussion generated more evidence of systematic discrimination affecting thousands of workers across entire industries. The media attention had made it impossible for companies to continue these practices quietly, and had created public pressure for federal enforcement action that went far beyond individual legal remedies. Sarah thought media attention would die down and be forgotten. Instead, it had created a permanent record of discriminatory practices that would follow her throughout her career and serve as a warning to other companies considering similar strategies. The class action lawsuit filing that Jennifer Walsh prepared was a legal masterpiece that connected individual cases of discrimination into a comprehensive pattern of systematic civil rights violations. The document, filed in federal district court, named not just TechFlow Solutions, but 12 other companies with similar demographic patterns and discriminatory practices. Williams v. TechFlow Solutions, ETL, became the case name that would define corporate accountability for age discrimination in the technology sector. The complaint detailed systematic violations affecting over 300 individual plaintiffs across 13 companies, with documented damages exceeding $40 million in lost wages, benefits, and career advancement opportunities. The legal strategy was brilliant in its comprehensiveness. Rather than pursuing individual employment disputes, Jennifer had coordinated with attorneys across the country to build a federal case that had demonstrated industry-wide discrimination patterns. This approach made it impossible for companies to dismiss the allegations as isolated incidents or personality conflicts between individual managers and employees. James Patterson, the former Marine I'd met during my job search, became the lead plaintiff for the consulting firm portion of the case. Margaret Sullivan, The client relations manager, who'd been pushed out of TechFlow, provided crucial evidence about how systematic discrimination had affected women over 45. Robert Chen, the financial analyst who'd been encouraged to take early retirement, documented the financial pressure tactics used to force older workers out of their positions. The evidence compilation took 8 months and filled over 2,000 pages of federal court filings. Email communications showing coordinated discrimination strategies, demographic analyses demonstrating systematic age bias, recorded conversations proving discriminatory intent, performance review comparisons revealing different standards for different age groups, and financial calculations showing the economic impact of systematic employment discrimination. TechFlow's stock price plummeted 35% on the day the class action was filed, wiping out over $60 million in shareholder value. The company's board of directors called another emergency session, this time focused on potential bankruptcy protection if the damages exceeded their insurance coverage and available assets. Sarah Chen's removal from her leadership position was announced the same day as the lawsuit filing, though the company tried to disguise it as a strategic reassignment to special projects. Everyone understood this was corporate speak for being fired, while the company attempted to maintain plausible deniability about the reasons for her departure. The legal devastating for TechFlow and the other defendant companies. Federal subpoenas required them to produce all employment-related communications, including emails, text messages, and internal planning documents that revealed the systematic nature of their discriminatory practices. The smoking gun document was a consulting firm report commissioned by TechFlow that explicitly recommended workforce demographic optimization through strategic performance management. The report, prepared by Morrison Strategic Consulting, provided detailed strategies for eliminating older workers while maintaining legal cover. Through subjective performance standards and cultural alignment assessments, target employees demonstrating legacy mindset characteristics, the report recommended utilize performance frameworks that emphasize adaptability, innovation, orientation, and cultural compatibility. These criteria provide maximum flexibility for workforce optimization while minimizing legal exposure through objective appearing subjective assessment. This document proved that TechFlow's discrimination wasn't accidental bias or poor judgment by individual managers. It was systematic. Policy implemented following professional consultation about how to discriminate legally. The existence of this report eliminated any defense based on good faith or unintentional bias. The Department of Justice's decision to join the case as amicus curiae transformed it from a civil employment dispute into a federal civil rights enforcement action. Assistant Attorney General Maria Rodriguez announced that the case represented systematic violations of federal employment law that require government intervention to protect the civil rights of American veterans and older workers. The federal government's participation meant that even if individual plaintiffs settled their cases, the underlying discriminatory practices would still be subject to government enforcement action. Companies couldn't simply pay monetary damages and continue the same practices. They would be required to implement comprehensive policy changes under federal oversight. Sarah's personal legal exposure became clear when prosecutors announced they were investigating whether her actions constituted criminal violations of federal civil rights statutes. While employment discrimination is usually handled as civil matter, systematic and intentional violations can result in criminal prosecution. Under federal civil rights laws, when discrimination is systematic, intentional, and affects protected classes, including veterans and older workers, Prosecutor David Martinez explained, it moves beyond individual employment disputes into the realm of criminal civil rights, violations that threaten the fundamental principles of equal opportunity. The settlement negotiations that began in month 10 of the litigation revealed the full scope of TechFlow's legal and financial exposure. The company's insurance coverage was insufficient to handle damages exceeding $20 million, meaning shareholders would bear direct financial responsibility for the discriminatory practices they had allowed to flourish. TechFlow's board of directors faced a stark choice: continue fighting a case where the evidence was overwhelming and the government was actively supporting the plaintiffs, or negotiate a settlement that would require comprehensive policy changes and massive financial penalties, but might preserve the company's continued existence. The legal reckoning had transformed what Sarah thought was a simple personnel decision into a federal case that threatened to destroy an entire company and establish legal precedents that would affect employment practices across multiple industries. Her attempt to quietly eliminate one older worker had instead created a legal earthquake that would reshape corporate accountability for age discrimination and veteran employment rights throughout American business. The settlement agreement that emerged from 18 months of litigation was a complete vindication of everything I had fought for, and a comprehensive repudiation of the discriminatory practices that had cost me my job. The document, signed by federal judges and witnessed by Department of Justice representatives, represented the largest age discrimination settlement in technology industry history. The financial terms were staggering: $47 million in damages distributed among 312 affected workers, with individual settlements ranging from $85,000 to $340,000, depending on career impact and lost earnings. My personal settlement of $285,000 reflected not just my termination, but the broader impact my case had created in exposing systematic discrimination across multiple companies. But the money, while substantial, was less important than the policy changes that would prevent future discrimination. TechFlow Solutions and the other defendant companies were required to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs under federal oversight for 5 years. Every hiring, promotion, and termination decision affecting employees over 40 would be subject to federal review and approval. The mandatory company-wide diversity training program was designed specifically to address the coded language and subjective standards that had been used to disguise age discrimination. All managers were required to complete 40 hours of federal civil rights training, with annual recertification and testing to ensure compliance with employment law requirements. The new hiring and promotion policies eliminated the subjective criteria that had been used to discriminate against older workers. Cultural fit, innovation, mindset, and energy level were explicitly prohibited as evaluation factors. All employment decisions had to be based on objective, measurable qualifications that could be verified and defended in federal court. Sarah Chen's career destruction was complete and irreversible. Her termination from TechFlow was followed by criminal charges for conspiracy to violate federal civil rights laws. While she ultimately received probation rather than prison time, her conviction created a permanent record that made her unemployable in any significant corporate leadership role. The professional consequences extended beyond TechFlow to the entire network of managers who had implemented discriminatory practices. Jake Morrison, Lisa Park, and David Chen all faced civil liability for their roles in systematic discrimination, with settlements that included admission of wrongdoing and agreement to never hold supervisory positions over workers in protected classes. The consulting firm that had provided TechFlow with strategies for workforce demographic optimization faced its own federal investigation and eventual bankruptcy when other clients realized they had been sold systematic discrimination strategies disguised as business consulting. Morrison's Strategic Consulting's collapse sent a clear message to the entire industry that facilitating employment discrimination carried severe legal and financial consequences. TechFlow's board of directors implemented a complete management restructuring that prioritized experience and competence over youth and innovation theater. Tom Martinez was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, with explicit authority to rebuild departmental cultures based on merit rather than demographic preferences. The company's public admission of wrongdoing was comprehensive and unambiguous. TechFlow Solutions acknowledges that its employment practices violated federal law and the civil rights of employees based on age and veteran status. The settlement statement read, "We accept full responsibility for systematic discrimination and commit to ensuring that all employees are evaluated based on performance and qualifications rather than age or personal characteristics." This admission became a permanent part of TechFlow's corporate record, available to potential employees, clients, and investors as evidence of the company's history of discrimination and the federal oversight required to prevent future violations. The ripple effects extended throughout the technology industry as companies realized that their own demographic patterns and employment practices might be subject to similar federal scrutiny. Human resources departments across the country began reviewing hiring and termination data to identify potential discrimination patterns before they became federal cases. The veterans advocacy organizations that had supported my case used the settlement as a foundation for broader legislative initiatives. The American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars jointly proposed federal legislation that would strengthen veteran employment protections and create criminal penalties for systematic discrimination against former military personnel. Client relationships that had been damaged by the discrimination scandal were slowly rebuilt through TechFlow's demonstrated commitment to policy changes and federal compliance. Jameson Industries and Morrison Group both renewed their contracts, citing the company's transformation as evidence that it had addressed the cultural problems that had led to discriminatory practices. The stock price recovery took over 2 years, but eventually exceeded pre-lawsuit levels as investors recognized that the federal oversight and policy changes had actually improved TechFlow's long-term prospects by eliminating the legal and reputational risks associated with discriminatory employment practices. My personal vindication was complete, but more importantly, the case had created legal precedents and enforcement mechanisms that would protect thousands of other veterans and older workers from experiencing the discrimination that had cost me my career. The settlement agreement included a provision requiring TechFlow to hire a chief diversity officer with federal law enforcement background and explicit authority to investigate and prevent employment discrimination. This position was created specifically to ensure that the systematic discrimination that had flourished under Sarah Chun's leadership could never happen again. The corporate consequences had transformed TechFlow from a company that discriminated against experienced workers into an organization that was legally required to prioritize merit and federal compliance over demographic preferences and innovation theater. Sarah Chun's attempt to create a youth-dominated workplace had instead created a federally supervised environment where age bias was not just prohibited, but actively monitored and penalized. The ultimate irony was that her discriminatory practices had resulted in exactly the kind of comprehensive oversight and accountability that she had tried to avoid through subtle bias and coded language. The new employment contract that arrived from Pinnacle Strategic Solutions was everything I had hoped to achieve before. Sarah Chun's discrimination derailed my career trajectory. Senior Vice President of Operations, 40% salary increase over my TechFlow position, comprehensive benefits, and explicit recognition that my military experience and proven track record were exactly what their growing company needed. Richard Hayes, Pinnacle's CEO, had followed my case through the media coverage and federal investigations. Our initial conversation revealed that he saw my fight against age discrimination as evidence of exactly the kind of principled leadership his company valued. "What impressed me wasn't just that you won your case," Richard explained during our first meeting, "but that you were willing to sacrifice short-term financial security to fight systematic injustice. That's the kind of character and commitment we need in senior leadership positions." Pinnacle's approach to employee value was the complete opposite of what I had experienced at TechFlow. Instead of viewing experience as a liability, they actively recruited older workers with proven track records and military backgrounds. Instead of prioritizing cultural fit and innovation mindset, they focused on measurable results and sustainable business practices. My new position involved rebuilding supply chain operations for a company that had grown rapidly but needed the kind of systematic planning and risk management that military experience provides. Within 6 months, I had reduced operational costs by 23% while improving delivery, reliability, and customer satisfaction scores. The recognition as a champion for older workers' rights opened opportunities I had never anticipated. Speaking engagements at veteran organizations, employment law conferences, and corporate diversity seminars provided platforms to share the lessons learned from fighting systematic discrimination. My first keynote address was at the National Veterans Employment Conference, where I spoke to over 800 former military personnel about recognizing and responding to workplace discrimination. The standing ovation I received was gratifying, but more important were the individual conversations afterward with veterans who had experienced similar situations and felt empowered to take action. I thought I was just unlucky or not adapting well to civilian work, one former Navy officer told me after my presentation. "Hearing your story made me realize that what I experienced was systematic discrimination, not personal failure. Now I know what to document and how to fight back." The mentoring role that emerged from my advocacy work became one of the most rewarding aspects of my post-TechFlow career, connecting with veterans who were struggling with corporate transitions, helping them understand their rights, and providing guidance about building cases against discriminatory employers gave deeper meaning to the battle I had fought. Maria Rodriguez, the talented analyst who had sought my advice at TechFlow, stayed in contact throughout the legal proceedings. She had been promoted to senior analyst after Sarah's departure, and credited our conversations about strategic thinking and professional development with helping her advance based on merit rather than demographic characteristics. "You taught me that competence speaks for itself when you create environments where it can be heard," Maria said during a coffee meeting 6 months after the settlement. Sarah's management style rewarded appearance over substance, but now we have leadership that values actual performance and results. The personal growth that resulted from fighting a federal discrimination case was unexpected but profound. Military service had taught me about courage under fire and standing up for principles, but the civilian employment battle required different kinds of strategic thinking and emotional resilience. Learning to navigate federal agencies, work with investigative journalists, coordinate with employment attorneys, and maintain professional composure while being systematically attacked was a masterclass in civilian leadership that complemented my military training. The financial security provided by the settlement and new position allowed Linda and me to rebuild the retirement planning that had been disrupted by my termination. More importantly, it demonstrated that standing up for principle didn't require sacrificing long-term financial stability. Sometimes fighting injustice creates better opportunities than accepting discrimination. My relationship with other veterans was strengthened by the case's visibility and success. Military service creates bonds based on shared sacrifice and commitment to values larger than individual self. Fighting employment discrimination became an extension of that service, protecting fellow veterans from corporate practices that violated the principles we had sworn to defend. The consulting work that grew out of my advocacy provided opportunities to help companies build employment practices that valued experience and avoided the legal risks associated with age discrimination. Instead of being seen as a troublemaker who had sued his former employer, I was recognized as an expert who could help organizations create inclusive environments that maximized talent while minimizing legal exposure. The ultimate personal victory was proving that age and experience are assets rather than liabilities when they're properly valued and utilized. My success at Pinnacle, my effectiveness as an advocate, and my impact on employment law demonstrated that the problem wasn't my competence or adaptability, it was systematic discrimination that wasted human resources while violating fundamental principles of equal opportunity. Sarah Chen had tried to convince me that my military background and 5 decades of life experience made me unsuitable for modern business. The federal case, the settlement, the new position, and the ongoing advocacy work proved that experience and wisdom remained valuable in any era, and that fighting discrimination creates opportunities rather than limitations. The personal victory wasn't just about vindication or financial compensation. It was about transforming a career setback into a platform for creating systemic change that would benefit thousands of other workers facing similar discrimination. The congressional testimony transcript that sits framed in my office represents the culmination of a journey that began with humiliation in a corporate conference room and ended with addressing the United States Congress about systematic discrimination against American veterans. The transformation from terminated employee to federal witness demonstrates how individual courage can create institutional change. Honorable members of the House Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, I began my testimony looking out at representatives who held the power to strengthen employment protections for millions of former military personnel. I appear before you today not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a veteran who discovered that the battle for American values doesn't end when you leave military service. The testimony detailed not just my individual case, but the systematic patterns of discrimination that federal investigations had revealed across entire industries. The demographic data was stark. Technology companies had reduced their over 40 workforce by an average of 31% over 5 years, with veteran employees experiencing disproportionately high termination rates despite superior performance records. The same companies that publicly praise military service and claim to support veteran hiring, I continued, have implemented employment practices that systematically eliminate veterans from their workforce based on age bias disguised as business innovation. The congressional hearing generated bipartisan support for the Veterans Employment Protection Enhancement Act, legislation that would strengthen federal enforcement mechanisms and create criminal penalties for systematic discrimination against former military personnel. The bill's sponsors cited my case as evidence that current protections were insufficient to address sophisticated discrimination strategies. The long-term impact on corporate age discrimination practices extended far beyond the companies named in our lawsuit. Human resources professionals across the country began implementing age bias training and demographic monitoring systems designed to prevent the kind of systematic discrimination that had cost TechFlow $47 million in federal penalties. Employment law firms reported a dramatic increase in age discrimination complaints, with many citing media coverage of my case as inspiration for workers who had previously accepted discriminatory treatment as inevitable. The legal precedents established by our federal case provided templates for documenting and prosecuting similar violations. Across multiple industries, my new role as a consultant and advocate allowed me to work directly with companies that wanted to avoid the legal and financial consequences of discriminatory employment practices. The consulting work focused on building inclusive hiring and promotion systems that valued experience while complying with federal civil rights requirements. Age discrimination isn't just illegal, I explained during corporate training sessions. It's economically inefficient. Companies that systematically exclude experienced workers are wasting human resources while creating massive legal liability. The mentoring relationships I developed with other veterans facing workplace discrimination became one of the most meaningful aspects of my post-TechFlow career, helping former military personnel understand their rights, document discriminatory treatment, and build cases against biased employers, created a network of advocates who were transforming corporate behavior across the country. James Patterson, the former Marine who had been a co-plaintiff in our case, established a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting veterans facing employment discrimination. Margaret Sullivan used her settlement funds to complete a law degree and now specializes in representing older workers in federal discrimination cases. The reflection on military service preparing me for this civilian battle reveals interesting parallels between defending American values overseas and defending civil rights in corporate America. Both required strategic thinking, careful documentation, coordination with allies, and willingness to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term principles. Military service teaches you that some battles must be fought regardless of personal cost, I noted during a Veterans Day speech at the local American Legion post. Fighting employment discrimination was an extension of that service, protecting fellow veterans from corporate practices that violated the principles we had sworn to defend. The message of hope for other older workers facing discrimination became a central theme of my advocacy work. Age bias is pervasive and systematic, but it's also illegal and financially costly for companies that implement discriminatory practices. Workers who document discrimination carefully and pursue federal remedies can achieve both individual justice and institutional change. The lasting change my courage created in corporate America is evident in the employment law training programs, demographic monitoring systems, and federal oversight mechanisms that emerged from our case. Companies across multiple industries modified their hiring and promotion practices to avoid the kind of legal scrutiny that had devastated TechFlow Solutions. Sarah Chen's attempt to eliminate one older worker had instead created a federal precedent that strengthened employment protections for millions of Americans. Her discriminatory practices, intended to modernize one corporate department, had actually modernized American employment law by demonstrating that sophisticated age bias would be met with sophisticated federal enforcement. The ultimate irony is that fighting employment discrimination proved more rewarding and impactful than the corporate career that Sarah had tried to destroy. The federal case, congressional testimony, consulting work, and advocacy platform provided opportunities to create positive change on a scale that would never have been possible within TechFlow's discriminatory corporate culture. My military service had protected American freedoms overseas. My employment discrimination battle had protected American civil rights at home. Both were forms of service that honored the principles our country was founded on, and both demonstrated that individual courage can create institutional change that benefits future generations. The legacy isn't just legal precedents or policy changes. It's the message that discrimination can be defeated when workers have the courage to fight back and the wisdom to fight strategically. Age and experience remain valuable assets in any economy that values competence over appearance, substance over style, and results over demographic preferences. The battle that began with Sarah Chun's bias had become a war against systematic discrimination that we were winning, one federal case at a time.